Hughes makes a pretty big song and dance about the fact that, we've had all these losses on the front. Why would Belgium, who's lost less people in the war than us, why would Belgium have a seat at the table and not us?
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast at the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Australia's 7th Prime Minister, William Morris Hughes, is one of the most colourful, divisive and enduring figures in Australian political history. Known more commonly simply as Billy Hughes, he served in the federal parliament for over 50 years, representing seats in both Victoria and New South Wales. He led the country through World War I and remarkably managed to be expelled from not one but several major political parties. He was Australia's wartime Prime Minister and the architect of some of our most controversial legislation. And he was a man whose voice echoed in both the streets of Sydney and the halls of Versailles and around Britain. Hughes was a master of polemics. The case for Labor remains, in Robert Menzies' words, the liveliest exercise in political controversy produced in Australia. Yet Hughes' story is one of contradiction. He's a radical Labor agitator, but then became the darling of Britain's conservative press. He was a fierce advocate of conscription who split his own party in two, and then the man who secured Australian control over New Guinea at the Paris Peace Conference while denying Japan's push for a racial equality clause. But today, Hughes is little studied, despite being at the centre of Australia's national story in the early years. What's the reason for this? Was it his political homelessness or the stain of his positions that jar with modern-day sensibilities? And how do we assess Hughes's relationship with Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister, Robert Gordon Menzies? A relationship that was marked by suspicion, rivalry, but ultimately admiration. Well, to help us answer these questions, I'm joined by Hugh Rogers, who is a PhD candidate in history at the University of New England. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Hugh.
Thanks, Georgina. Nice to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you here, Hugh. And you've chosen to study Billy Hughes, write your PhD thesis on this. And honestly, this is a gift to Australia because we have been doing this podcast for over 4 years and have been trying to make sure we have a podcast on every former Prime Minister, especially our early Prime Ministers. And Billy Hughes has eluded us up until now. So thank you. But I mean, that is evidence that he hasn't been studied or is not being studied much these days, despite, for a while he was Australia's longest serving Prime Minister and a World War I Prime Minister, so incredibly important, particularly important role in the Treaty of Versailles at the Paris Peace Conference. Why do you think Hughes is so understudied despite his prominence in our national story?
It's a good question. I think you've referred to his homelessness before. He doesn't easily fit into any of the stereotypes. So, for example, historians at the left tend to ignore him when they're looking at international relations, even though he was the first Labor leader who was prominent in that area. So the historians of the left start international relations with Doc Evatt in 1942, for example. So that's perhaps one reason. He does get studied, but he gets studied as a byproduct of other things. So he's very prominent in Neville Meany's work on Australia and the World Crisis, which came out about 15 years ago. He's also fairly prominent in Beaumont's Broken Nation. So any study of World War I is going to have to be, to some extent, a study of Hughes. But yeah, you're right. In his own right, I mean, there was a massive biography that came out about 40 years ago that's still used as a reference point, but hasn't been studied much since then.
Do you think left-leaning historians in Australia, that they see World War II more as a kind of a pivotal moment in that Labor post-World War II is, in terms of the international relations agenda, is a party of sort of liberal internationalism, and that's sort of much more palatable than that kind of early Labor view of Australia's engagement with the world, which was very nationalistic, very much imbued with white Australia. I mean, Hughes is opposing Japan's proposal at the Paris Peace Conference for racial equality. And, Hughes is very concerned about this impact of this on white Australia in Australia. I mean, his instincts and advocacy for policies at that time really jar with our modern day conceptions of equality and tolerance. And I think also how we view the world too.
I think that's true. But even Doc Evatt, who's a hero of historians of the left, particularly when you talk about international relations, Doc Evatt still wanted to protect the white Australia policy. That's in the 40s. It's still got another 20-odd years to go before people start stepping back from it. I just think his connection to empire probably jars just as much as his defence of the white Australia policy. He's very much portrayed as being almost a dual citizen of Australia and of the empire. I don't think that's quite right. I think he would always put Australia's interests ahead of Britain's and did a couple of times in the 1920s, but he's still seen as being very much tied to that British Empire encapsulation of Australia, if you like. And I think that jars just as much.
And I mean, it seems unfair in some respects because he, of course, makes sure that Australia, as a dominion of the British Empire, has a seat at the table at the Paris Peace Conference. I mean, he's a great advocate of the importance of Australia being independently represented, not just being represented by the British. So, yes, a man of empire, but also a great Australian nationalist.
And I actually think his greatest achievement at the Paris Peace Conference was actually being there at all, as you said. Although he achieved some of his goals and didn't achieve others, the fact that he even had a seat at the table in the first place was probably the most important thing. And he had to fight really hard, along with the other Dominion leaders from South Africa, New Zealand and Canada, had to fight quite hard to get there. So he deserves recognition for that, and he does get recognition for that.
I think he suffers too, like Joe Lyons does, having been kicked out of his political home, the Labor Party. Joe Lyons chooses to leave the Labor Party. But the Labor Party won't own Hughes, they won't own Lyons, because they go to the opposition. Lyons obviously goes to the newly formed United Australia Party, which then ends up being the Liberal Party. And Hughes, there was only one party Hughes didn't join, and that was the Country Party.
Correct, yeah.
So when you are politically homeless, who's there to champion your legacy?
Just on that point about the Country Party, Hughes said he had to draw the line somewhere.
I love that, yes. When you're politically homeless, who then champions your legacy when you're gone?
I think that's right.
Not the Labor Party. It's not going to be the Liberal Party. Menzies, in the end, not a fan of Hughes. He recognises Hughes as important, but he doesn't personally like Hughes, and I think he thinks he was in politics just that tad too long.
Which might well be true. Yeah. But I think you're right. And he certainly doesn't fit into any of the stereotypes. So people who've got a particular agenda, he's not going to sit easily with their agenda, whatever it is, whether it's left or right.
So let's start off at the beginning anyway with Hughes. Tell me his origin story. I love an origin story.
So he's born in London of Welsh parents, and he makes quite a big thing of his Welsh parentage. His mother dies when he's 5, and for a while he's actually living with his grandmother in Wales before he goes to London to finish his schooling. That Welsh heritage, as I said, is something he played on quite a bit. And there was one of the Welsh newspapers in 1916 used to refer to him as Australia's Welsh Prime Minister. It was quite a big thing. And cartoonists played around with the fact that Lloyd George was Welsh and Hughes was Welsh. And there's a cartoon of Asquith saying to Lloyd George, talk to him in Welsh and calm him down, or something to that effect. He ends up coming to Australia when he's 22. The first 5 years in Australia, not a lot is known about. And the only source of information is Hughes himself, and he's a very unreliable witness to his own story. But we know he was in outback Queensland for a couple of years, picking up whatever work he could get. He worked on a railway for a while, so he would have had exposure to some hard manual labour. He ends up in Sydney, still doing whatever work he can pick up. Eventually opens a little mixed business with his wife. And one of the things they did in that business was sell political pamphlets. It's like a corner convenience store. And that became a bit of a melting pot, a gathering place for some of the radicals in Sydney. This is in Balmain. And gradually gets his interest in politics, works for a while as an organiser of the Shearers Union out in central New South Wales, ends up as a socialist and an early member of the Labor Party, and ends up in New South Wales Parliament in 1894 and will stay in Parliament, whether state or federal, until he dies in 1952.
His parliamentary journey, I think, is amazing. I mean, we'll get on to his views and his prime ministerial life, but I was reading, I think he's elected the member for Lang in the New South Wales Parliament, as you said, in 1894. And then he's elected in the new federal parliament for the seat of West Sydney, I think it was.
Yes.
And then I think he loses that, doesn't he? And then he goes to a seat, is this right, in Victoria, the seat in Bendigo?
I don't think he loses it. I think it's after he leaves the Labor Party. But you have to remember that Parliament's in Melbourne. So Bendigo's easy to get back and forwards to. But yeah, he moves seats a few times.
And then he goes back to Sydney to be the member for Bradfield. I mean, talk about connection to community. That's of no concern to Hughes. But yeah, so he's a political survivor.
Absolutely.
I mean, his resilience and tenacity and ambition obviously is incredible. I think it's also interesting that he comes from a pretty humble and difficult circumstances, but he's obviously really fascinated in ideas. And that, I mean, it's later on, but this book, The Case for Labor, that I talk about in the introduction, and it's republished, I think, in the 1970s, and Robert Menzies writes the foreword. And this is well, obviously, after Hughes has died. But it's based on opinion pieces he'd written for the Daily Telegraph. And it's almost like, at the time, the kind of forgotten people broadcast equivalent for the Labor Party. And to think, this was Hughes marking out where ideologically Labor sat, the principles of Labor, of Australian Labor. And yet no one talks about The Case for Labor as an important book, whereas the Forgotten People broadcasts and the publication of the 37 key speeches of that, a holy Bible for Liberal Party people. So it's interesting again how he's so important, Billy Hughes, and yet so very much forgotten or overlooked.
And The Case for Labor did a lot to normalise the Labor Party in people's thinking, made it less scary and therefore more electable. Hughes was, Munro Ferguson, who was the Governor-General when Hughes was Prime Minister, saw Hughes as the real intellect within the Labor Party. And I think what you're talking about is exactly that he did a lot to shape and define the Labor Party. But he wasn't as radical as some. So, for example, Andrew Fisher, when he first becomes deputy leader in a ballot against Hughes expected to win, but the more militant industrial side of the Labor caucus supported Fisher. So he was more centralist, I guess you could say, but he still considered himself a socialist.
So Chris Watson, who's the first Labor Prime Minister, I think, of a national government. I think there was a state government. I think it was in Queensland, wasn't it?
Yes,
that was the first Labor government in the world. But anyway, Chris Watson's very important early Prime Minister. He appoints Hughes as Labor's first ever External Affairs Minister. I mean, that's a significant appointment for dear old Billy Hughes. How did he end up getting such an honour?
So originally he was offered the Attorney General's role, but he'd only qualified for the bar a few months earlier, so might not have thought he was experienced enough, although knowing Billy Hughes, he'd never lacked in self-confidence, so maybe that wasn't the reason. By not taking the Attorney General's position, it gave them an opportunity to bring somebody from the protectionist group in, which would have been helpful because Watson was a minority government. External affairs wasn't such an important role we might think it is, because Britain still constitutionally looked after Australia's external affairs. So Hughes was mainly dealing with controlling immigration and who got into the country and who didn't. And that was almost the extent of the role at the time. It had previously been handled within the Prime Minister's department. It was considered the second most important role in the government after the Prime Minister, but actually there wasn't a lot to it.
Right, yeah. And he'd made a bit of a name for himself, hadn't he, in London at the shipping conference where he was sort of representing Australia. So he'd had some experience in external affairs.
The shipping conference, I think, comes later. I think it's 1906 or 1907. And that was really about Australia and New Zealand and the Empire countries trying to get aligned on shipping navigation legislation so that the shipping companies didn't have to change the way they did things depending on what country they're in.
Did Hughes show an interest in international relations, do you think, in his sort of early days in New South Wales Parliament or federal politics?
The reason he made the switch from state to federation, because the things that he was interested in were federal responsibilities. And one of them, immigration was one and defence was another. The other one's in industrial relations. So certainly when you think about immigration, you think about defence, he's certainly interested in Australia's place in the world and how it protects itself and how it controls who comes into it.
And he ends up our seventh Prime Minister. I mean, how did he get to that position? That's always a fascinating journey, and it was a time of huge political tumult in those early years where Prime Ministers and governments sort of lasted like a year or two, and then they're all in minority. We had the 311s, and it was it was a difficult and tumultuous time.
So Andrew Fisher's the leader of the Labor Party and the Prime Minister, and Hughes is his deputy. I don't think Fisher was really cut out to be a wartime leader. He made decisions by consensus. He liked to consult. He liked to take his time. Wartime needs more energetic, urgent decision-making. I think Fisher found it quite difficult and it wore him down, and he increasingly delegated responsibilities to Hughes in any case. When the role of High Commissioner to London became available, I think Fisher jumped at it as a way of moving out of the Prime Ministership. He takes the High Commissioner role and Hughes becomes leader of the Labor Party and Prime Minister. I don't think anyone stood against him.
Yeah, I mean, he is someone who I think demonstrates great political instincts and judgment, at least in those early years. So that sort of, ability to lead in a time of crisis is I think very, it's essential. But he was able to demonstrate that to his colleagues. What was he like as our wartime Prime Minister, Hugh?
I don't think he consulted very much. He was the opposite of Fisher. I think he made most of the decisions himself and annoyed his colleagues because of it. He was out of the country a lot. He was gone for probably 6 months in 1916. Then he leaves early 1918 and he won't come back until after the war's well and truly over. There are legitimate reasons. He's in Britain to consult with the government and then he stays on for the peace conference and what have you. His main activities in Australia in wartime, apart from recruitment, were the 2 conscription referendums.
Yeah, which of course,
and that was
a hugely controversial and, his handling of them will, dictate his political fortunes. So Robert Menzies is a university student here at Melbourne University at the time of World War I, and he writes a prize-winning essay on the rule of law during war. And it's partly an analysis of Hughes's enemy aliens legislation and the War Precautions Act, this sort of idea that governments during wartime, during a time of crisis, will be able to take away some of your rights and deprive you of your liberties. I mean, do you get a sense of Hughes's concerns over individual freedom and constraints on that, or is he just sort of steely-eyed on we need to win this war and control the country and put everything, all resources, both human and industrial, to the service of this war effort?
I think that's true. I also think it's true he saw it as an opportunity to gather more power into the federal parliament. to take over some things that had previously been state responsibilities. He also saw it as a chance to bolster Australian industry. He put a lot of effort into removing foreign, German, control of the Australian mining industry and to encourage secondary processing in Australia. So he took the war as an opportunity to do some nation building as well at the same time. But individual liberties probably weren't his number one priority. I mean, the conscription referendums would suggest that, if nothing else.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, Robert Menzies himself is in favour of conscription, yet he is also in favour of individual freedom. So there is a massive tension there. You mentioned Hughes spending a lot of the war in Britain, which, Robert Menzies himself spends 6 months overseas during World War II. He's a World War II Prime Minister from 1939 to 1941. It's partly a necessity because communications are so very difficult in that era, but it also is partly a product of the fact that Britain is sort of running the war and, Australia is supporting that effort as part of empire. But it's, if we want to make sure our interests are heard, having our most senior political leader in the halls of Whitehall and Westminster is essential. But, why do you think Hughes took the view he had to spend most of the war in Britain and not in Australia?
So, first of all, in World War I, it takes 6 or more weeks just to get there. So if you're going to go to Britain, you're going to be gone for a while. And prime ministers before him had spent several months in Britain at a time. Barton had, Deakin had, Andrew Fisher had. He went there to consult with the British government about the progress of the war and how Australian forces were being used and what have you. He's there for about 3 months in 1916, and he stays on partly to attend the Paris Economic Conference in June 1916, and then he comes straight back. In 1918, he probably would have gone for the same type of period of time, but then they can see that peace is close, and with his colleagues in Australia decided he should stay and be part of those peace negotiations so he can try and negotiate the outcomes that Australia was looking for, which included getting control of New Guinea and Nauru and what have you.
He's pretty concerned about Australia's economic position during the war, isn't he? And we're in some economic difficulty and he's wanting financial aid and to secure ships to make sure that our export-oriented economy is able to get our exports over to Britain. Was he successful in advocating for those things?
He was. He upset the British government because he actually went and bought ships when the British government was desperate to get their hands on ships themselves. And there was a bit of conflict over that, but eventually the Australian government, I think, ends up owning 7 ships so that they could guarantee, I think it's wheat and wool exports to Britain. Hughes does a good job of selling Australian output to Britain during the war. He's also very keen to block German economic interests after the war as well, seeing it, he argued we can't let Germany become as economically strong after the war as it was before the war. But I think there's a subtext to that doesn't come through, and that's he saw an opportunity to bolster the Australian economy by being able to replace some of the things that Germany was doing before the war. Again, it comes back to using the war as sort of for some nation building.
Yeah. What was his relationship like with the British prime ministers during World War II? We've talked about Asquith and David Lloyd George. Perhaps better with David Lloyd George. Could bond in Welsh.
So Hughes didn't have much time for Asquith, and Hughes was probably a bit of an embarrassment to Asquith. Asquith was unpopular with the conservative press in Britain because he was seen as a prevaricator. They used to call him, or the cartoonists called him, Mr. Wait and See. So Hughes is the antithesis of that. Hughes arrives in England and starts making stump speeches saying we've got to put all our efforts into winning the war. And the conservative press loved it, lapped it up, made it headlines, and really used him to make their own arguments for them, but clearly would have been an embarrassment to Asquith. There's a cartoon in one of the evening papers suggesting Asquith had bought Hughes his ticket and wanted to send him home, something along those lines. In 1916, Hughes and Lloyd George have a good relationship. Hughes had impressed Lloyd George at that shipping conference you talked about, that Lloyd George was chairman of. In 1918, when Lloyd George is Prime Minister, there's some conflict between the two, particularly over the peace negotiations, and Hughes was very outspoken in his criticism of Lloyd George and the lack of consultation.
I mean, it's quite ironic, isn't it, that Hughes becomes such a darling of the British conservative press. I mean, he goes up and down the country making speeches, and I think there was some calls that he should be replacing Asquith at some stage.
There were suggestions and incentives. There was apparently incentives for him to stay, promises of a seat in British Parliament, a seat at the cabinet table. I think there were similar calls for Menzies in World War II, in fact.
Yeah, apparently.
And there had been for Deakin beforehand. So if you're on the stage for a short time, you can impress, and it becomes harder the longer you're there. But Hughes's thinking and the Conservative thinking in England was more in tune, particularly around things like tariffs and the importance of empire, whereas Labor in the Labor Party in Britain, for example, were free traders. So it was probably that natural affinity because they shared the same thinking on important topics.
But his advocacy on trade policies does sort of mean he isn't true to his sort of political homes. Does that foreshadow, I guess, what's to come when it comes to sort of questions on, say, conscription, where Labor mainly parts company with Hughes's views?
Yeah, I haven't really thought of that connection. I mean, Hughes starts out life as a free trader. When he goes into federal parliament, I think it's Deakin that turns him around when Deakin's protection policies tried to guarantee improvements in working conditions as well. And when Hughes saw that tariffs could benefit working people, he becomes a supporter. And then what he's advocating for in England and Britain in 1916 and 1918 is sort of a wrap around the empire and preferential trade, preferential tariffs within the empire, and using tariffs to sort of try and block external trade, which is another way of trying to bolster the Australian economy. And, we can sell you more if you don't buy it from Germany. I mean, the issue there is, what about the neutrals? Before America enters the war, what about America? Are you going to block trade with America, or are you going to block trade with Belgium, who's an ally? So it's complicated.
So he spends this time overseas and becomes quite, I think, disconnected from the extent that Labor and the trade union movement in Australia is opposing conscription. I mean, his experiences, of course, at that time are, he goes to the front in 1916. He sees that need of more troops to reinforce Australian troops in World War One. So, he comes back to Australia and orders this, they call it a referendum, but, a plebiscite. It was completely unnecessary. It was it had no kind of legal effect. It was more just a public relations, opportunity. It's like the plebiscite we had a few years ago on same-sex marriage. In the end, the government can propose legislation, the parliament either passes it or not. Whether the public has voted separately on an issue is irrelevant in our democratic system. But anyway, this is a moment where not being on the ground in Australia means he finds himself quite at odds with the public on an issue that he feels very strongly about.
Yes, but there are two reasons, I think, why he was so committed to conscription. One is Australian recruitment numbers were falling off. Australia couldn't replace the troops that were returning because they were injured or worse. The other issue is Japan and the White Australia policy. Japan had been making overtures to open the immigration doors in Australia to Japanese immigrants. Japan was an ally of Britain's, and I think Hughes wanted to be a good partner to Britain. The risk was, after the war, Japan would lean on Britain and say, can you open the doors to immigration in Australia? And Hughes wanted to block that. And So being a good partner on the warfield was a way he saw of doing that.
Yeah. So you think it was really this sort of sense of foreboding about what the Japanese would do on immigration that led his champion of the conscription issue in
I think
16
it's a factor.
and 18. Yeah.
I think it's a factor. I mean, he was committed to winning the war. And Andrew Fisher's comment about the last man and the last shilling, he wanted to be true to that. Recruitment was falling off. So if the war had gone on another year, there would have been less Australian divisions than there were in 1918. The British were already talking about melding Australian soldiers into British divisions because we didn't have the numbers to support our own. So all those factors, but the Japanese thing is certainly a factor in play.
How did the conscription plebiscites, and there were two of them, how did they play out then, Hugh? Can you give an analysis of the two campaigns?
They were pretty ugly. The first one was fairly close in the end. I can't remember the numbers, but the no campaign won, but not by very much. Interestingly, in the second vote, the no vote was stronger. One of the things that's interesting is that the troops themselves voted no. So the ballots coming in from the Western Front. And the theory is that the soldiers on the Western Front knew how bad it was and thought, you can't force people to be here if they don't want to be here, sort of thing.
And then, I mean, he resigns as Prime Minister after the second plebiscite is defeated. How did he view his political fortunes when he made that decision?
Well, I think he'd promised the electorate that if he lost the referendum, he'd resign. So he did. The Governor-General reached out to a few other people, but either they couldn't put a government together or they wouldn't put a government together, and eventually said, you have to have Hughes back. I don't think the Governor-General, Munro Ferguson, was quite a fan of Hughes, although they sometimes clashed over etiquette and communications with Britain. I think he would have been quite happy to have Hughes back.
And do you think his expulsion from the ALP changed how he was viewed overseas in Britain and by political leaders over there?
It doesn't seem to have.
No.
So when he's there in 1916, he's the Labor Prime Minister. When he's there in 1918, he's the Nationalist Prime Minister.
And that's irrelevant to them.
It doesn't seem, the British press made more of the fact that he'd lost two, they call them elections, whereas in fact he'd won a landslide in the actual federal election. He'd lost the two conscription referendums, but they made a thing of that. But changing parties doesn't seem to have been a factor.
Well, maybe, for the British press, political parties in Australia weren't much of a feature. It was Australia that was the main thing. He's there, as we were saying before, for the Paris Peace Conference. Can you tell me how he made sure he got a seat at the table, which I think is a significant achievement, and then what his achievements were at that conference?
So initially the British were proposing that Britain would represent the Dominions, and then there was the thought that the British delegation would include one representative of the Dominions, which would have been difficult because there were four, as well as Australia. There's South Africa, New Zealand and Canada. And in fact, Newfoundland, I think, was still a Dominion then. There's a lot of backwards and forwards, and Hughes makes a pretty big song and dance about the fact that, we've had all these losses on the front. Why would Belgium, who's lost less people in the war than us, why would Belgium have a seat at the table and not us? In the end, it's agreed that the Dominions will be part of the British delegation, but on matters that directly affected them, they could have their own voice, which actually Hughes recognised was the best of both worlds, because rather than being a small country on the side, by being part of the British delegation, you're actually at the heart of decision-making that went on behind closed doors. But then when you need to, you can make your own arguments, as he certainly did. The big things that mattered to him were what would happen to the German colonies in the Pacific, particularly in New Guinea and Nauru. And effectively, he was successful in gaining control of them. I mean, it was through the League of Nations and it was through something called a mandate, but in effect, Australia had control.
And does for decades too.
Yes. I think New Guinea's might be up until the 1970s, I think, maybe. Japan wanted to insert a racial equality clause in the preamble to the League of Nations Covenant. Hughes almost single-handedly was successful in that not being included.
And can you explain why Japan was pushing for that? I mean, they obviously were concerned about racial inequality or racism towards them.
Yeah, and I think it's where I'm no expert on Japanese politics, culture or history, but I think it's about them saying where we stand in the world. It's we're your equal, and it's not just by talking about race, you're also talking about nations. So Japan is the equal of America, the US and Great Britain. But Hughes basically single-handedly managed to stop it. But the Americans actually didn't like it either. But they were quite happy to stand back and let Hughes be the fall guy.
And why didn't the Americans like it?
Because it had implications for Japanese immigration, which was an issue on the west coast of the US.
Right, yeah.
It's not dissimilar.
Hughes's interventions and achievements at this Paris Peace Conference, do you get a sense that that's really Australia's beginning of its own foreign policy, of an Australian foreign policy as distinct from an empire foreign policy?
So
historians foreign policy?
Historians disagree on that. Some see it as a point-in-time event. Others see it as the beginning of something that's continuous or something that develops. I think it's something that develops. But the next 10 years are fairly benign in terms of international affairs generally. There's not a lot going on, so it's hard to test. There's a couple of times where Britain asked Australia for troops in a couple of small skirmishes that were going on, and Australia said no. So Australia was expressing an independent point of view on that. There was an imperial conference in 1921 where Hughes had quite an impact. So I think it is the beginning of the development of an independent voice for Australia. There's just not a lot to test it in the next 10 years or so until we get into the 1930s and the European problem again.
Do you think, though, what he was able to achieve at the end of World War I set us up for how we interacted with World War II?
Yes. And one of the outcomes of the Paris Peace Conference is that the Dominions are allowed to establish their full sovereignty, nationhood at a time of their choosing. And Canada and South Africa took that opportunity quite early. I think it was 1931 or something that the Statute of Westminster has passed. Australia doesn't actually take it until World War II, probably because we didn't feel we needed to. But Hughes's actions in World War I at the Paris Peace Conference are certainly a precedent for World War II, particularly when Curtin becomes Prime Minister and asserts Australia's right to control its own troops.
Hughes obviously loses the Prime Ministership, and I mean, he stays in politics for decades after that.
The rest of his life,
Yeah. I mean, why do you think he did? Because, I mean, Menzies himself sort of, had admired Hughes early on, not agreed with him, but admired him, and then by the end, thinks he really has passed his best.
Interestingly, Lloyd George in England also stays on in Britain. So Lloyd George loses the Prime Ministership about the same time as Hughes does. Lloyd George stays in House of Commons until 1945. It's got to be said there weren't any jobs commentating on TV for ex-Prime Ministers, so you had to do something. But I think he still had ambitions.
Right. Thought he'd come back. Yeah. Well, he does. I mean, he leads the United Australia Party in 1943. So, there's a
when Lyons dies.
Yeah, in 1939.
There's United Australia Party ballot for the leadership. A couple of other candidates fall away, and it becomes Menzies and Hughes. And on the first ballot, it's tied. And then one person swaps their vote and one person abstains, and Menzies becomes the Prime Minister. But he was that close to fulfilling his ambitions, and I think maintains them for another 10 years or so.
Yeah, just extraordinary. His relationship with Menzies does sour pretty badly in the last part of his life. I mean, can you describe that relationship?
I think while Lyons is alive, they're both in Lyons' cabinet. So Menzies goes into federal parliament in 1934. So Hughes is already 72. So his best years are behind him. But they're both in Lyon's cabinet. And I think while they're colleagues, I think they got on all right. I think there's a bit of respect. I think there's a bit of humorous banter between them. They seem to pass notes backwards and forwards that weren't about affairs of state. Once Lyons dies and they become competitors for the leadership, I think that the relationship becomes more difficult. I don't think there was a lot of talent in the UAP. I think they were the two big men of the UAP, even though Hughes is approaching 80. Hughes wanted the job and Menzies knew that Hughes wanted the job. So, yeah, I think it was strained, and ultimately Menzies becomes leader again towards the end of the war, and Hughes ends up getting expelled.
Yeah. I think over Hughes's refusal to boycott the Advisory War Council and also his support for the 44 Powers referendum.
I think Hughes staying on the War Advisory Council gave them a good excuse to move him on. But what's interesting about that, though, is Curtin and Doc Evatt really wanted Hughes on it. They really appreciated and respected his experience from the First World War and commented that he was still one of the most strategic thinkers in that council. And Curtin basically, when the UAP pulled out of it, Curtin goes to Hughes and appeals to his patriotism to stay on, and Hughes can't say no.
I wanted to finish our discussion today, Hugh, with a quote from Menzies from the foreword to the case for Labor. Because when I was reading this, I was reflecting that this is sort of what people often say about Menzies and his Forgotten People broadcast and how it was so easy for him back in the 50s and 60s. So Menzies writes, "The world has become a more complicated place in which the pragmatic approach has become increasingly inevitable and the business of politics has become more complex and involved. We have become more inductive and less addicted to stern processes of deductive reasoning." And you think, I mean, people say today, politics is so much more complicated. It's 24/7 media cycles, social media, all this stuff, now AI. But I wonder, I mean, human beings are still human beings. And yes, I guess a way we regulate economic and social activity is much more complicated than it was, 100 years ago in Hughes's case, but even 50 years ago in Menzies' case. But I suspect it's just something that is used looking back on time to say, it was easier then, it's much harder now. It makes us feel like we've got the real challenge. They just, they had it easy.
And then you think, there are 8 cabinet ministers with all the responsibilities that 24 or however many we have now have. And cabinet ministers today have huge departments. There would have been, I think the Prime Minister's department might have been 3 or 4 people.
Yeah.
There was a lot more balls in the air for individuals than now. So things change. Do they get better? Do they get worse? They just change.
Well, Hugh Rogers, thank you so much for bringing the life, colour, drama, provocation, controversy of our 7th Prime Minister, William Morris Hughes, to the Afternoon Light podcast.
It's been a pleasure, Georgina. Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.